Okay, so before I even start telling you this story, I need you to understand something very important about me, something that took me years to even admit to myself, something that lived in the quietest corner of my mind like a secret room that I kept locked and refused to visit. And that thing is this: I have always felt like the clothes I wore on the outside never quite matched what I felt on the inside. And for the longest time I had absolutely no words for that. No language, no framework. Just this low humming ache that followed me everywhere. I went like a shadow that refused to behave, and I pushed it down and I buried it, and I smiled at family dinners and I played sports with cousins, and I grew up performing a version of myself that kept everyone comfortable while I slowly, quietly, desperately wondered why I felt so disconnected from my own reflection in the mirror. And this story, this absolutely chaotic and humiliating and life-changing story, is about the single most terrifying and ultimately most freeing afternoon of my entire life, an afternoon where every wall I had carefully built around my secret came crashing down, not gradually, not on my own terms, but all at once, loudly, dramatically, in front of the last person on earth I would have chosen, and somehow, it became the beginning of everything good that came after. So take a breath, because we are going in deep and this is going to take a minute. I was 22 years old and I was living in a rented apartment in the city, my first real apartment, the kind you get excited about because it has a door that locks and nobody can just walk in on you. And for me, that door that locked meant everything, because inside that apartment I had a secret, a small, carefully curated, deeply treasured secret, tucked inside a box at the very back of my closet behind winter jackets and boxes of old textbooks. And in that box was a collection of clothing that had taken me 3 years to assemble item by item, each piece bought in a different store, each purchase made with racing pulse and trembling hands, each item brought home tucked under other shopping bags like contraband, because in a very real way to me it felt like contraband, like something illegal, even though intellectually I knew it was just fabric, just clothing, just things that humans wear. But the guilt and shame attached to it felt enormous and suffocating, and every time I considered getting rid of it, all I would think about how I felt when I wore it in private, alone, with the curtains drawn and the door locked, and that feeling was the only time the humming ache went quiet, the only time I recognized my own reflection, the only time something in my chest relaxed and breathed, and I thought maybe I am okay. The Maid dress had been the most recent addition to the collection, and it was also the most dramatic, the most obvious, the most undeniably costume-like piece I owned, and I want you to understand why I bought it, because it matters to this story, because it was not some random impulse purchase. I had found it online after months of seeing characters in shows and anime wearing them and feeling this pull that I could not explain. This recognition that made no rational sense and every emotional sense, and when it arrived in the plain brown shipping box, I stood in my apartment with the box in my hands for a full 10 minutes before I opened it, and when I finally pulled it out and held it up and saw the way the black fabric caught the light and the white apron detail fell perfectly and the little lace trim at the collar sat just so, something in me completely fell apart in the best possible way, like a dam breaking after years of holding back water. And I sat down on my kitchen floor. And I just breathed for a while, holding this dress, feeling something I had no name for but which felt enormously, overwhelmingly like coming home. I had worn it exactly 4 times in the 6 weeks since it arrived, always alone, always with curtains closed, always with my phone face down, and each time I wore it I did not feel silly or embarrassed or wrong. I felt like myself, which is the thing that is hardest to explain to people who have never experienced the particular vertigo of feeling more like yourself in something unexpected than in anything you have ever been told is meant for you. And I want you to keep that feeling in mind, because it is the whole heart of everything that is about to happen. Now here is where the timing becomes catastrophically, spectacularly bad. My older brother Zaid was supposed to be in another city that weekend. He had told me he was going to visit his college friend for 3 days. I had confirmed this. I had even helped him pack by reminding him about the charger he always forgets, and I had that whole weekend completely planned in my mind. I was going to spend Saturday with myself, really with myself, no performance, no maintenance of the outside version. Just me in my apartment being exactly who I was when nobody was watching. And when Saturday morning arrived I woke up and I felt something close to joy, which sounds small but was actually enormous for me, and I made tea and I ate breakfast and I watched videos for a while, and then around noon I went to the closet and I opened the box and I took out the Maid dress and I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and I just stood there for a moment taking in the image of myself and thinking quietly, sincerely, with the full weight of self-recognition, yes, this is Something real about me. This is not going away. This is not a phase. This is a part of who I am. I had also found a small black headband with a lace detail that matched the dress, and I put that on too, and I looked at myself and I started to feel the particular kind of calm that only that experience ever gave me, and I went into the living room and I put on a comfort show and I sat on my couch and I was present in a way that I almost never was, and an hour went by, and then another, and I was so deep into that feeling of being genuinely at rest that I had completely stopped listening to the world outside my apartment, which is the only explanation I have for why I did not hear the key in the lock until it was already turning. Let me tell you what happens to your body when the thing you have kept secret for years is about to be exposed in approximately 1 second, and your brain knows it, but the rest of you has not caught up yet. First, every single muscle goes rigid at exactly the same moment. Then your stomach drops so fast it feels like you stepped off a ledge. Then your mind starts running calculations at 1,000 miles per hour trying to figure out how to undo time, how to reverse what is already in motion. And then the door opens and there is your brother standing in the doorway with his duffel bag over his shoulder and his keys in his hand, and his face doing the specific thing that faces do when they see something that takes a full second to process, going through surprise and confusion and recognition in slow motion while you stand there in a black and white maid dress with a lace headband on, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything except watch the exact moment your carefully maintained secret crosses the point of no return. His friend had gotten sick, he said later. His friend had gotten sick Friday night, and so the trip had been cancelled, and he had just come home and he had not texted because he thought I would be out and he just wanted to come home and decompress, and those facts arrived in pieces over the following hours, but in that exact moment all I could process was the look on his face and the sound of the door clicking shut behind him and the absolute silence that followed. I want you to understand that Zaid and I were not the kind of brothers who talked about feelings. We were raised in a household where you showed love through action and teasing and showing up, and never through sitting down and saying what was actually in your chest, and I did not know what version of him was going to walk through that confused silence. I did not know if I was about to be yelled at or mocked, or if he was going to leave and call our parents, or if he was going to say something that could not be unsaid. And the not knowing was so much worse than any specific bad thing, because at least with a specific bad thing you know what you are facing. He set his bag down. He walked to the kitchen. He filled a glass of water. He drank it. And then he turned around and looked at me again and said, in the most ordinary voice, the voice he used when asking what was for dinner or whether I had seen the remote, he said, "Is that comfortable?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "The dress. Is it comfortable?" "It looks like it would be comfortable actually." And I said absolutely nothing because my brain had prepared responses for anger, for disgust, for mockery, for pleading, for negotiation, for every version of conflict. But it had not prepared a single response for genuine casual curiosity delivered in the voice of someone asking about furniture. I said, "I don't know what's happening right now." And he said, "I'm getting that. Yeah. Why don't you sit down?" And something in his tone was so steady, so not alarmed, so completely unlike the explosion I had been bracing for, that my legs actually moved me to the couch before I had consciously decided to do anything, and I sat down in my maid dress with my lace headband, and I put my hands in my lap and I looked at the floor and I waited for the real reaction, the one that was definitely coming. This calm had to be the before part. There was definitely an after part coming. Zaid sat in the armchair across from me, the one he always claimed when he visited, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and he looked at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before, and he said, "How long?" And I said, "How long what?" And he said, "How long have you been doing this?" Not in an accusatory way. In a genuinely curious way. The way you ask someone how long they've known about something that you are just now learning about. And I said, "I don't know, a few years in some form. This specific thing maybe 6 weeks. And he nodded like I had said something that made sense to him, and he said, "And does it make you feel better?" Like, actually better. Not as a question with a wrong answer, just as a question. And right there something in me cracked open because nobody had ever asked me that. Nobody had ever gotten to ask me that because nobody had ever known to ask, and the honest answer was yes. It made me feel better in a way that I had spent years not allowing myself to fully acknowledge, and I said yes, quietly, barely above a whisper, and I was shaking a little. Not with cold but with the specific trembling that comes when you have been carrying something alone for a very long time and someone else finally touches it. And he said okay. And I said okay. And he said yeah, okay. I mean I have about 1,000 questions but none of them are going anywhere. Do you want tea? I want tea. And he got up and went to the kitchen and made tea, just like that, and I sat on the couch in my maid dress and I heard the kettle filling and the click of the stovetop and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon, and I did not know what to do with the fact that the world had not ended, that the ground had not swallowed me, that the thing I had feared for years had happened and the person I had feared it happening with had responded by making tea. When he came back and handed me a mug I said I need you to understand that I don't fully understand this myself. And he said that's fine. And I said I've been trying to figure out what it means for a long time. And he said, and have you figured anything out? And I said I think it's just part of who I am. I think some part of me is different from what everyone assumes and I've been trying to figure out how to hold that and keep living at the same time. And Zaid looked at me for a long moment and then he said something that I have thought about almost every day since that afternoon. He said, I've been watching you work really hard to be okay since we were kids and I never knew what you were working against. I just knew you were working against something. And I thought maybe now I know. And I started crying, not loud crying, not dramatic crying, just the quiet kind where your eyes just decide they're done holding it and the tears just come, and I didn't try to stop them and Zaid didn't try to do anything about them. He just sat there and drank his tea and let me have the feelings I was having, and in that moment I understood something that I hadn't expected to understand, which is that being seen by someone who loves you is the most terrifying and most necessary thing in the world. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, longer than we had talked about anything real in probably our entire adult lives, and he asked questions and I answered them as honestly as I could, and some of the answers were I don't know yet and some of them were I've been thinking about this since I was 15 and some of them were I've never said any of this out loud before, and that last category was the biggest one. There was so much I had never said out loud before. Not because no one had ever asked, but because I had never let myself ask. I had kept so much of myself quarantined from even my own examination, and here was my brother who I had always assumed would be the worst possible person to have this conversation with, sitting across from me asking me real questions and taking real answers and not flinching, not leaving, not turning it into something horrible. At one point he asked me if I was scared and I said of what exactly, and he said of what comes next, of figuring out who you are out loud instead of just inside your own head, and I said yes, very, because I didn't know what that looked like. I didn't know what version of myself would exist on the other side of honesty. I had spent so long maintaining the performance that I genuinely wasn't sure what was left underneath it when you took the performance away, and he said you're still you. Whatever you figure out, you've always been you. And then he paused and he said also for the record you have genuinely good taste, that dress is well made. And I laughed, I actually laughed, and it felt like breathing for the first time in a very long time. Here is what happened in the weeks after that afternoon, because this story doesn't end with tea and tears. The aftermath matters. The aftermath is actually where the story lives, because having one person know your secret does not magically dissolve the weight of it. What it does is create a hairline crack in the wall and then light starts coming through the crack and things look different, not fixed, but different, more possible. Zaid didn't tell anyone, not because I had to beg him not to, but because he understood without my having to explain that this was not his story to tell, that I would navigate the who knows and when on my own terms, and knowing that he knew and that he was still exactly my brother, still calling me to complain about work and still stealing food from my fridge when he visited, that changed something structural in me. Something load-bearing shifted and what I had expected to be a collapse turned out to be a renovation. I started being more honest with myself after that afternoon, not with everyone, not all at once, but with myself. I started letting myself look at the things I had been quarantining and examine them in real light. I started journaling, which I had always dismissed as something I didn't need, and I started seeing a therapist, which I had been avoiding for years with the specific avoidance of someone who suspects that therapy will make them face things they are not ready to face, which is of course the exact reason to go. And my therapist was a quiet, careful person who asked me questions in a particular way that made me feel like my answers were welcome rather than evaluated, and in that space I began to understand things about myself with a clarity that I had never been able to access inside my own head. I understood that what I had been experiencing my whole life had a shape, that other people had this shape too, that I was not uniquely broken or defective or confused, that I was a person navigating something real about my identity that happened to not fit the default assumptions of the world around me, and that navigating it was going to take time and courage and trial and error, but that it was navigatable, that people did this, that people came out the other side knowing themselves and living honestly and being genuinely okay, not performing okay, actually okay. The Maid dress, which had started all of this, sat in my closet after that day in a different way, not hidden in the box anymore but on an actual hanger, and sometimes I wore it when I was home and sometimes I didn't, and neither felt like a big decision anymore. It was just a piece of clothing that I liked and that made me feel like myself, and it had stopped being a secret that lived in a box and started being a thing that was simply true about me. There was a moment about 2 months after the afternoon with Zaid where I was getting ready to go out, just a casual thing, dinner with a couple of friends, nothing significant, and I was standing in front of my mirror getting dressed and I looked at my reflection and I didn't feel the disconnection. I didn't feel the gap between who I was on the inside and what I was presenting on the outside. And I realized that this was partly because I was allowing myself to wear things that felt more like me, even in public, small choices, nothing dramatic, but choices made for myself rather than for the comfort of invisible observers, and the reflection looking back at me felt continuous with the person looking at it, and that continuity, that simple basic continuity between inside and outside, felt like the most extraordinary thing I had ever experienced. I told one more person about 6 months later, a friend named Priya who I had known since we were both 20 and who had always had this quality of making you feel safe enough to be real, and her response was to spend the next 20 minutes showing me fashion videos and asking which ones I liked, and then she said she wanted to go shopping with me sometime if I ever wanted a second opinion, and I said maybe, which is what I say when I mean yes but need to get used to the yes first, and 3 weeks later we went shopping, and it was the first time I had ever walked into a store and looked at things I actually wanted with someone who knew exactly what I was doing and was there, fully there, enjoying the afternoon. I want to talk about the question of identity because this story is really about identity more than it is about any specific piece of clothing. The dress is a symbol of a much bigger thing. The dress is just the object that the story needed to get started, and the bigger thing is this. We are all taught from a very early age to understand ourselves through categories. This is what boys are, this is what girls are, this is how people like you behave. This is what is normal, and most people fit comfortably enough inside their assigned category that they never really have to question the categories themselves, they just live inside them without friction, and for people like me the friction is there from the beginning. You can feel the edges of the category pressing against parts of yourself, and you have 2 choices. You press yourself smaller to fit inside it, or you figure out what you actually are regardless of whether it fits. I spent 22 years pressing myself smaller. And then I wore a Maid dress on a Saturday afternoon when my brother wasn't supposed to be home, and the door opened, and the pressing stopped. I do not want to make this sound cleaner than it was because the truth is that figuring out who you are is not a linear process with a tidy conclusion. There are still days when I struggle with the gap between who I am internally and how the world reads me externally. There are still moments when I put on the outside version of myself and feel the old familiar ache. There are still situations where I choose discretion over authenticity because the world is still what it is and not every space is safe, and that is a real and complicated truth that I hold alongside the progress, because progress and difficulty can coexist. Understanding yourself better does not mean the world automatically understands you, you just stop needing it to in quite the same desperate way. But here is what changed, here is the actual transformation that this story is about. I used to need the world to not see me in order to be myself. I needed closed curtains and locked doors and total privacy to access the real me. And now, not all the time and not in every situation, but now, I can access the real me even in the open, even in the presence of other people, even with the door unlocked. Because the real me is no longer something I believe I need to protect from the world. It is something I am slowly, carefully, courageously learning to introduce. And it started with a Maid dress and a Saturday afternoon and a brother who came home early and made tea. The thing about timing is that we spend a lot of our lives waiting for the right time to say the hard thing, the right time to show the real part, the right time to stop performing and start living, and the right time almost never arrives on its own. The right time usually has to be forced into existence by the wrong time arriving first, by the door opening before you expected it. By the thing you feared most happening in the most undignified and dramatic and completely uncontrolled way possible, and then you survive it, and then you discover that the survival is the beginning of something, not the end of something. I wore a Maid dress at the wrong time. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I think sometimes the universe does that. I think sometimes the exact thing you have been avoiding decides it has waited long enough and it finds a way to arrive, and you can fight it or you can sit down and drink tea and let the truth of yourself finally take up the space it deserves. And I sat down, and I drank the tea, and here I am telling you this story, which is itself an act of choosing the open door over the locked room, of deciding that my experience is worth speaking even in a world that doesn't always know what to do with it. If you are someone who keeps a box in the back of a closet, literally or metaphorically, if you are someone who locks the door before you let yourself be real, if you are someone who has spent years pressing yourself smaller to fit inside a category that never quite fit, I'm not going to tell you that the right time to open the box is now or that you should force anything before you are ready. Because readiness matters and safety matters, and you get to decide your own pace and your own terms. But I will tell you this. The version of you that lives inside the locked room is real, that version deserves air and light and someone handing them a cup of tea, and somewhere out there is probably a person who will respond to the real you the same way my brother responded to me, not with the disaster you were prepared for, but with something so ordinary and so kind that it breaks your heart open in the best possible way. And you will not know who that person is until the door opens. And the door usually opens before you are ready, and you will survive it. And surviving it is where your life actually begins. That's my story. That's the whole thing. A wrong time that turned into the right time. A locked door and a key and a brother who made tea. A Maid dress hanging on an actual hanger now, in an actual closet, belonging to an actual person who is slowly, imperfectly, genuinely learning to live in the open. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know.